So today we talk with Shay Brown on this episode of Are You a Robot? In case you're new here, we are a series that aims to explore the biggest questions around AI and related technologies. The way that we're doing this is by gathering some of the best and brightest minds, the trailblazers in their fields, to come and talk to me about what they're doing and see if we can form some best practices. So, if you enjoy these conversations, they don't finish here. You can get more of AI ethics and governance in your life by going to our Slack community. You can find a link for that down below in the description. And I highly encourage you to jump in, say hi, give us a little bit of an update of who you are, what you're doing, and why this is important to you. The last thing that I will say is we have a killer sponsor. Ethics Grade is a ratings and benchmarking company for AI. If you are interested in your company getting rated on AI ethics and governance, you're definitely going to want to talk to the team over at Ethics Grade. Feel free to click the link below and give them a shout. All right, let's get into this episode.
Are you a robot?
I'm pretty excited to talk to you, man. I've been doing quite a bit of research on just bias in AI and fairness and ethical AI. And I run a ML Ops community also. And so it's been coming up more and more in for people that are practitioners. So I think it's gonna be a good chat. I want to get everything up though, just so that I have my notes up too. And what we can start off doing, if you're cool with it, is have a quick intro from you, like how you would describe.
Yeah, by way of introduction. So my name is Shay Brown. I have a PhD in astrophysics. And so like a lot of people in this field, I came across it sort of very tangentially. And in my research, I'm a professor at the University of Iowa. And so I do research in astrophysics. But in my research, I use machine learning. And so you'd look at a galaxy and you'd want to be able to automatically, let's say, classify a galaxy without a human having to look at it. And so I got into machine learning this way. And then in 2018, I founded a company, Babel AI, with the original intention of it being a space exploration, basically building artificial intelligence for space. But as I started looking at the field, I realized that here on Earth, there was all sorts of problems with how machine learning was being applied to applications that make very important decisions about people. And I happen to have the luxury of having a lot of philosophers and ethicists who are my friends and colleagues here at the University of Iowa. And so I pivoted and we founded this company is now focused on algorithmic auditing, and in particular looking at the ethical implications of algorithms, how they're used, and bias, which is sort of the thing that really started, I think, this whole AI ethics trend, the bias in algorithms and societal bias. That is one piece of the puzzle that we're looking at. But that's what our company focuses on. Is we will come in as a third party and audit an algorithm and give our clients some sense of what are the possible risks, ethical risks that could come up because of the implementation of that algorithm.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating stuff, and I really want to dive in deeper to how you look at like fairness and how you look at bias and what people can expect. But instantly, I think about something that I saw just the other day, and it was right now. I assume that you're doing it manually. Am I wrong to assume that? Like when you go and audit an algorithm, it's you auditing it, correct?
That's right, and this is human powered. And so, I mean, one of the sort of slogans of our company is human oversight in machine intelligence, because I think at this point, I mean, we all know that eventually it will become automated, but the auditing of algorithms will only become automated when we actually know what we're doing. And I don't think that anybody
Mm.
really knows what they're doing yet in this field. It's too new, um, and we haven't seen enough of what could possibly happen negatively that
Mm.
I think we can have any confidence that we can automate this process at this point. And so
Yeah.
this was a deliberate decision, um, to make sure that we have humans actually looking at the data and looking at the algorithms and making uh, choices and making decisions about how to intervene and how to test these algorithms.
Yeah, it's like you read my mind, because that was really the first question that I was going to lead with was, do you see yourself doing it in an automated fashion, or potentially having a machine learning model rating models for their potential bias or their unethicality, or if that's a word.
Yeah,
And so it makes total sense that right now, and I think that is a fascinating point, is how we don't have enough data. We don't know how this could go horribly wrong. Maybe right now you're thinking to yourself that we've seen a lot of things go wrong, but we don't really, in the grand scheme of things, have a good idea of what is hitting the target, hitting that bullseye yet.
that's right. It's the field is too dynamic, and new
Mm.
algorithms are being produced every day. There's a lot of people moving into the field of artificial intelligence, a lot of very highly motivated people, and also companies are very very highly motivated to increase their profits by streamlining their workflows and things like this. So
Hmm.
at this initial phase, it's not to say that it can't be automated. So what would happen is, let's say after people have taken a lot of care in how they design the algorithm, and they've done the careful analysis of what are the potential ways in which this algorithm could negatively affect people, could hurt, either infringe on their rights or their interests. And when you do that work, you start realizing, well, you know what, this part of the algorithm is critically important. Getting that part of the algorithm right, whatever it may be. And typically in the community, they talk about fairness metrics and all of this, right?
Yeah.
Making sure that it's not biased in particular ways. Now, once that's set up, once the hard work, and that's really hard human work that takes the community, and it also takes a lot of people from who are being affected by that to have a voice in this process. Once that's done, sure, then you could say, all right, this is the key. These are the few metrics I need to pay attention to. Let's automate that process so that someone can come and look at and see whether my machine learning model, is somehow behaving badly. But if you don't do that work ahead of time, then you can't automate it. So that's what I mean by the automation. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It makes total
Eventually,
sense.
we can.
I see that clearly, that the groundwork is not laid. There needs a foundation. There needs to be that strong foundation still. And so you were talking about these different ways that um, you basically, that you will look at the fairness of an algorithm, or you will look at what an algorithm does. How have you seen, like, the bias in machine learning play out, I guess we could say? I mean, and we all are familiar with, or I imagine most of us are familiar with, the pieces where people are getting recommended um, things on Amazon. We're getting recommended stuff on Netflix to watch. But what are ways, and then there's the more controversial stuff, like with face algorithms not detecting people, certain genders as well as other genders. I think it's females. They don't detect females, and especially if you're of minority groups, they detect you less. What are other ways that you've seen things go wrong when it comes to machine learning models and the ethics around it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I mean, so natural language processing does have a lot of there are a lot of examples where natural language processing, which is not a typical classification. So the classic example was with recidivism, and everybody that sort of started the field where the bias was very clear. And a lot of the fairness research and bias research has been focused on these classification algorithms. But now natural language processing, which is I take some natural language sentence, could be somebody's resume, it could be somebody's voice transcribed by a computer, and then I want to infer something about that person because of that language, or infer something about a document, right? And here it's not so obvious because it's not just a straightforward, classification. And I mean, it is. A lot of them are classification, but the ways in which it could negatively affect someone is subtle. And so you can imagine we've experienced a case where there was a sentiment analysis system which was going to be used. It wasn't being used, but it was going to be used essentially to rank, comments. So there was people who were making comments about their superior, either a teacher or a manager or something like that. Mm-hmm. And there are many, many comments, and an organization wanted to essentially record the top sort of most promising comments. So what are the highest sentiment? This person was really, really amazing. They wanted to get the best of those and have those on file. And then they want also the worst ones. Let's see what the kind of the most negative things were. And then they also maybe would want to record some average of those, the sentiment. So I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the sentiment analysis, but it basically just says, how positive or negative is the sentiment. And it's often one of the first things you do in machine learning when you're learning is you look at movie reviews and you write a classifier that's going to essentially do this sentiment analysis on like IMDb movies. And unfortunately, a lot of times when people write these sort of sentiment analysis things, they do actually use some of these data sets like IMDb to train their algorithms. And we now know that there's both gender and racial bias in these. So if you change, if I say John was an amazing manager, and I look at the sentiment of that, and then I say Jane was an amazing manager, at the face of things, that's the same sentence. The fact that it's John versus Jane should make no difference, but the algorithm will score it a lower sentiment. Not all algorithms. This particular algorithm did. When I change that one variable. And then if you change also classically names which might be associated with different races or ethnicities. So if I put Muhammad there, or if I put Jerome or something like that, that also will change the sentiment for no apparent reason, because obviously the person's name should not have any effect on that sentence. So this happens. So the problem is that will change how this system works. Now, it turns out in this case, it's most of the algorithm actually did a pretty good job at finding the best comments and the worst comments, even though there was this bias. So it turned out that was actually not the biggest problem. But the biggest problem we found is that there was an offset in the system. So basically it skewed towards, I can't remember whether it was positive or negative bias. And what that actually turned out is that managers or teachers who had fewer or more comments would end up getting a skew in the average that they got assigned. Yeah. So it was actually the average score that was problematic because there was a problem with the algorithm. So it turned out not to be anything, but it still was a problem. But it turned out not to be the bias. So this is the case where it's sometimes very subtle. And what you have to do is you have to take the whole algorithm from input to the decision that gets made by the system to the decision and therefore action that gets made by the people who use that information. And so we actually had to look and say, how important are these scores to the people who make the decisions in the end? Because that has a huge effect. If they don't even look at the scores, then maybe it's not that big of a deal. So there's a lot of work in following that whole causal chain of what we call the algorithm. Most people focus on that little middle piece, which is the machine learning part. but you have to look at the entire chain to figure out where are the opportunities for people to get harmed.
Well, and that's fascinating, this idea of from start to finish, from A to Z, right? You don't just look at it as the piece that has the crazy bit of math in it. You look at it as the whole thing, from what was the data, how was that data collected, to who and how are they using the score that is being outputted from it. And so this idea, though, and this use case that you speak about, I find also really interesting, because you're talking about this bias that tends to happen usually with when it comes to gender, right? Gender bias, I know, is a big one within machine learning. And I was talking about this with some friends, and they were saying, yeah, one way to counter this is by flipping the names or flipping the gender, and to see if your algorithm is fair, right? That's one way to show, like, hey, is my algorithm fair? Well, let's see. This is a feature, the male or female, right? So if I flip them, then we'll be able to see if the algorithm outputs the same thing. But then a counterexample from another friend who was saying, yeah, but sometimes that's the whole point, is we need that gender to output something different for an algorithm. And let's say that we're talking about e-commerce. If I am someone on e-commerce and I am a male or female, the algorithm is probably going to want to recommend me something different, right? Depending on male or female. That's a highly simplified example. I know this, but it is really interesting, because for e-commerce, it's cool, and between commas or between quotation marks, right? But if we're talking about whether or not somebody is getting a loan, then it's definitely not cool to be able to look at the bias on male or female, or not the bias, but the output being different. And so maybe we could just talk about that a little bit, and how these features really, it's a lot about the features that you're choosing and the use cases that you're using them for.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's highly context dependent, which goes back to our original statement about, can this be automated? And the answer is no, because the way you would automate testing for an e-commerce would be very different than you would do it for lending or some sort of insurance underwriting or something like that, or HR, where in those cases it's highly regulated. And so it has to be context dependent. And so the question you have to ask is, so we have a general methodology in our company that we sort of, I wouldn't say we came up with it in the sense that it's super novel or anything, but we had this problem when we first started. We had this exact problem where, how do you approach this very question of sort of auditing an algorithm and saying, how good or bad is it, and what needs to be done about it in a systematic way, given that there are so many use cases. And so essentially what we came up with is this process, which has just been accepted now for publication. So we're excited about that.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. And basically the way it is that we try to separate things in as the dumbest way you could possibly do it. And essentially what we have is, instead of having principles, which is what a lot of the things like fairness and transparency and all of those sorts of things, that felt a little too muddled. Because when you say fairness, oftentimes people will talk about the technical aspect, which is like bias, which is sort of a property of the algorithm. And then there is some normative connotation. What is fairness, right? And what fairness means is different in different aspects. So what we did is we focused on the interests or the rights of the people who are affected by the algorithm, the stakeholders. And so the first thing we do is they say, who is involved in an e-commerce transaction? Well, who is it? Well, it's clearly the person who's surfing the web, and they're getting the things on Amazon popping up on the right-hand side or whatever that are being recommended, these things. There's the people whose things are getting recommended, right? The people who are selling things. There's Amazon. There's society in general, right? So we list all the stakeholders, and then what we do is we just say, what are the interests of these stakeholders? Now, this is very general, right? It doesn't mean what they're interested in. We're talking about sort of morally salient interests, things that the extreme end are rights, right? And these are interests which have, the state would have some duty to protect, right? So, and human rights would be sort of the highest level of that, where these are interests that the states have a very high duty to protect those interests. But we could just talk in general. What are things that people autonomy, right? Autonomy is one of them. They have an interest in non-discrimination. They shouldn't be treated differently and so we have all of these interests over here. And then on the other end, we have just general features of the algorithm. So the fact that maybe it's going to serve something different. It's going to show a different advertisement to someone who's male or female or transgender. There might be something different that those people are going to see, and maybe it's different based on their race as well. And maybe that's only because of some proxy, the things that they might be searching for online or what country they're from. Then there's other sorts of metrics, which is on the other side, besides this sort of technical things about the algorithm. There's also things like transparency. Is the person aware of the fact that there's an algorithm behind that? Mm-hmm. Or do they just think that it's something very simple that's just popping up whatever is the last thing you looked at? There's other aspects of transparency. There's aspects of security. Now, in some cases, that person's data is being used, and how secure is that? Is there other features on this other side are things like potential for abuse, which is sort of different. It's mixed a little bit with the normative side of rights, but how easy is it for someone to co-opt this algorithm and say, I'm only going to send, I know that I want to sell these sneakers to you, and so I can target you directly, and I can make sure you only see my sneakers on the right-hand side. Mm-hmm. And that may seem okay if you're doing e-commerce, but there's also potential for abusing that. There's ways in which that can be abused. And then we have to connect those pieces. So, and the connection, we call it the relevancy matrix. I won't get into the details of that, but basically for each of these features, we say, how relevant is it for that interest? So you have an interest in autonomy. And whether you know that an algorithm is working in the background, the transparency is actually pretty highly relevant for your right to autonomy, because you need to know whether you're making these decisions on your own or you are being coerced into making those decisions, because maybe they've highly optimized all of these things. Yeah. So that's highly relevant. And so it's kind of important that you are aware of, cognizant of the fact that you are being manipulated in that way for your right to autonomy, which, by the way, is actually a human right. That's one of the fundamental human rights. Your right to non-discrimination, right, which is over on this side, that's less relevant. The transparency, whether you know there's an algorithm or not there, is kind of less relevant. What you really care about is this other bias piece. Are you being shown job ads which are just for low-paying jobs, where somebody else is being showed high-paying jobs? Yeah. And so we have to map this. And so my long answer to your very good question was that it's complicated. And to say, in fact, that it's cool to do that in e-commerce is actually not a straightforward question, because who am I to say that you are a man or a woman? Who am I to say what your identity is at all? And you have some choice. We would like to think that you have some choice to want different things, or to change your mind, or to have some agency in how your life goes, whether that be what you buy or what jobs you see. And so it's not a straightforward thing to think that it's okay to do it in one sphere, and in particular e-commerce. That's still a gray area. And I think, in my personal opinion, the more that we are, because we're thinking about this as well. We don't have any clients in this area right now, but we're looking ahead to that. And I think that the answer is it's not so obvious. And I'm leaning towards the fact that it's, if you're going to be doing that sort of thing, it has to be highly transparent to mitigate the harm. It has to be
Yeah.
obvious. I need to let you know that you're being manipulated.
Well, let's talk about that transparency for just a second, because I think when you were saying that, like, notify the individual that they are being targeted by an algorithm or they're being coerced by an algorithm, right? I don't think I've ever seen that. I've never seen a company that says, "Hey, look, we're using this machine learning algorithm. Here's the results." And so, how and when I guess, how is that going to happen? How is there going to be a company that will just break through the chains and say, all right, we're going to be very transparent. We're going to let everyone know that they are being used by a machine learning algorithm right now? Or how do you see that coming forth and more transparency being incorporated into this?
Well, I mean, I think there are companies that are doing this. So that are beginning to think about how this could be implemented. So, you know, I don't want to be quoted off the top of my head, but I think that both Facebook and Google have something akin to this. So you might have noticed something that says, "Why did you see this ad?" So if it pops up, there might be a little tiny thing that says, "Why did you see this ad?" Or, you know, you have the option of like, "Was this ad useful for you?" or something like that. But then also, "Why did I see this ad?" And if you click on that, what it's essentially going to tell you is you saw this ad because of X, Y, and Z. You searched for, I don't know the details of how much transparency they go into it, but what I would like to say is that we think you are a white middle class male who was shopping for watches recently, and we thought that you would want a Rolex or whatever. Okay, and we showed you the ad for this reason. Now, if you do that in a way that people actually click on it or notice, that gives me a chance to pause and to use my sort of my intellect as opposed to just instinctually being manipulated online, which is what mostly is happening. They're not talking to your sort of your frontal brain. That allows me to pause and say, you know what? Do I want to be a person who's being sold Rolexes? I don't see myself as that person, and I can reflect on my decisions, and I can maybe opt out of this. I don't want you to serve me these sorts of ads, right? And so the ideal is something along those lines. I don't think anybody knows what the ideal is. Let me put it that way. Be clear about that. We don't know. This is a highly sort of debated and an outstanding problem in the field. But something what I would think would be the ideal is something that actually allows me to step out of this sort of automatic, just droning through the internet, and to allow me to make a conscious decision about how I want to either be perceived by other people, or how much that whatever they think about me gets reflected on my online experience.
Yeah, and that is true. Like, now that you say that, I have on YouTube seen you recommended this because people who like this also use it, and they're starting to bring it more to the forefront. I'm wondering how it can be brought more into our lives so that it is something that we see and we take that pause, like you're talking about, and we recognize it more and more, as opposed to it's a few clicks away and I have to really want to know why I'm seeing this random ad, or I really have to not like something that I'm seeing to go and make the necessary steps or take the necessary steps and get rid of it. So it is very interesting too that you mention we don't know what the ideal looks like yet. Is there something that for you is more of an ideal? Like, when I think about it, I think about it is very much when you are recommended things. If we're going back to these recommendation engines, when you're recommended things, it says with the recommendation, it comes with, hey, you're recommended because of this, this, and this. That might get scary though for companies because they're saying, well, we followed you all around the internet. And because of what we saw, all these different data points, we recommend this, right? But that is a fairly harmless one. I know that, like we were mentioning, e-commerce still, it's debatable if it's cool or not. And I see your point on that. Then we have ones that are more high stakes. And if you're looking at anything in HR, like you were talking about, we really need to be very, very cognizant of how an algorithm is behind our job application.
That's right. And I mean, the high stakes situations have to be regulated by law. Like I think that there's no way around it. In the case of HR, there already are regulations. They just need to be enforced. You cannot discriminate when you're hiring someone, and so it's a matter of, we have this new technology which is essentially kind of a black box, and it sort of it masks some of these discriminatory practices, right? Now, whether it actually does or not, I mean, we've had clear cases where it has had problems. So we know that in some cases it does happen. And so now we just have to, in the case of HR, we have to regulate the use of these algorithms such that we reveal illegal practices, algorithms which are breaking the law. And in other places, we have to have new laws, which so in the case of like facial recognition and things like this, or in the education industry where algorithms are being used and the laws are not clear or not existent, we have to have regulations which govern that. And then it will be clearer how to make those interventions. And you're absolutely right. It's not going to be comfortable for companies to reveal. It's going to, if I'm surfing the web, it's not going to be great for my experience, if I'm constantly being interrupted saying, you know what, you're being manipulated right now. Did you know that? Or you got to this website because we tricked you into clicking on this thing, or that's not even a great experience for me. And so, but luckily there's a whole field of human computer interaction where people are working on how can I have a good experience, but also have a lot of transparency. And so that's where our work would connect up with behavioral sciences and these human computer interactions, and where we say, what's the experience someone can have with an algorithm, which is going to maximize their autonomy, but also keep a lot of the streamlined features of ease that make it an enjoyable experience. And that's the problem. It's just but there is a solution, I think, and it's just we need to find it. And it might be different for different algorithms. The way it gets implemented is going to be different in different spheres. But we just have to have the regulations in place to motivate companies to do this, to mandate that they do it, and then we have to do the research. How is it that we can make sure that you don't get your rights infringed upon? But you are still able to have access to all of the wonderful things that the internet does give us.
So let's change gears a little bit real fast. And I think we all have an idea in our heads of why we need to be ethical. But I'm wondering, just in your opinion, like, why is it that ethical audits matter? Why should we be concerned with those if we're a company or if we're a consumer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as a consumer, I think it's very straightforward. The reason you would care about an ethical audit is that you would want to have somebody looking at this system, that the socio-technical system that this algorithm is being implemented in, who is not primarily concerned about profit, maximizing profit. Okay? Now, just the way our economic system is set up, companies, especially publicly traded companies, have a mandate to maximize profits and to take care of their shareholders and their interests. Okay, and if I'm a consumer, I want somebody who's looking at this algorithm to make sure that my rights and interests are being protected. And there are lots of nonprofits that focus on protecting consumers and things like that in other spheres. And now we just need to highlight this one potentially dangerous area of artificial intelligence and say, we need that same thing for AI. And one of the many mechanisms for doing that is have a third-party independent audit that says, you know what, we looked at all of this, and here are the places where you could run into trouble, where people can get hurt. And these, this is what you need to fix. These are the ways to mitigate that. In the case of the companies, I think in my mind, it's also very clear. But just look at the kind of scandals that are happening with companies now that are having problems with biased algorithms. It's a severe reputational risk to be implementing AI in a reckless way. At the very least, reputation can be affected. It could also cause fines, and you could lose a lot of money because you get fined. And last, unfortunately, it's last, but it's the right thing to do. So you'd also want to feel good about that you're actually helping the people that you're providing services to. And so companies should care because that due diligence is important. Now, someone might come along and say, well, we'll just internally do it, right? Because I'm talking about specifically third-party auditing. You hire somebody to come in and or it's mandated, but they come in and look at the algorithm. And I think internal audits are also important, and it's something that should be done. And I think companies are doing it. I know of several that are doing it, and that's a very important thing. But you also need to have an independent set of eyes. And again, it's that separation of the profit. It has to be people who their primary mission for that task is not maximizing profit. And that's important for everybody to have that infrastructure of trust. And if you look at the financial audit, that was exactly the problem. The reason the financial auditing system is the way it is because so many problems. They had to have this, what they call the infrastructure of trust, where the financial sort of bona fides of these companies had to be vetted via third-party auditing. And that allowed other people to have trust in the fact that everything was being taken care of. And so I think when this becomes a law eventually, you'll find that people are going to be much freer to use AI in their services because they have this ability to trust that everything is being looked at in a rigorous and independent way.
And so you mentioned when this becomes law, eventually, how far out do you see that? And knowing that AI is moving so fast and machine learning is moving so fast, do you feel like it will be able to keep up with the times?
I think it's coming soon. I think it is coming soon. And so the fact that AI is outpacing law, we're in that period now. So right now, every day you go on the news, and people who care about this, which are the people who are listening to this, they're the people who care. I'm sure that they see a new article every day about this company has done this, or this algorithm has done that, right? We're in that period right now. And so very soon, I think we're going to see that the first real regulations. So New York City is working on, for HR, they're working on a regulation now, which will mandate audits. It may not be third-party audits, but audits of hiring algorithms. On the national scale, in the U.S. anyway, in 2019, there was the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which has not passed, but it's been proposed. And under that act, they would have a mandated, not just bias audits, but they actually want sort of what is akin to an algorithmic impact assessment, which is basically what our company does, is looking at the broader socio-technical system and doing an assessment of what are the potential impacts of this system on all the stakeholders. And that's part of that law. And so that could be passed this next year and come into effect whenever it might be the year after, or maybe immediately. And so the time is now. I mean, companies now need to be thinking about this, because it won't be long before something like that gets passed, either locally or national level, where they're quickly going to have to realize that they need to do their due diligence and look at how these systems could potentially affect people. So in my opinion, I think 2021 is going to be the year that audit becomes a thing that is very much at the forefront of these issues.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think it's fascinating to also highlight that you're talking about things happening on state levels too. A lot of the times I think we expect in the US, I guess, is we're expecting that the US government is going to do something, but it is just as powerful if someone can be that trailblazer on the state level and show, hey, this needs to happen. If the US government isn't going to do it, then we're going to do it as a state. And also you see that there's in the EU, they're coming out with regulations. And I've talked to Paul McDonald about regulations, and he was a bit skeptical when it came to them because of trying to put like a blanket over all of AI and saying we need regulations when there are some that are, like we talked about, there are very high stakes and they need different regulation. You can't say that AI is just so vast. You can't give like, hey, this needs to be regulated, and then think that, okay, we're going to go about and regulate it all in the same way. And I'm wondering what your thoughts and opinions are on that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. And I think it is high stakes places are where you need to hit it first. But let's take this requirement, this sort of one that is not a requirement now, for an algorithmic impact assessment done by a third party, as an example of a potential regulation. That doesn't cover everything, clearly. But if you were to mandate that, then low stakes algorithms, it would be a very easy job. And it would be, and so you would do it and you'd say, listen, there aren't any big problems with this. But it also would catch the police using facial recognition, which could potentially be biased. Yeah. And so it's a simple requirement of just transparency. Tell us what this algorithm does, tell it who it affects, and tell us that you've at least taken the time to think about what are the potential negative impacts. That's it. And make that public. And just that is going to, across the board, essentially lower the risk that algorithms are going to do bad things, because people have to at least take the time to look at it and present that. Now, then in higher stakes situations, there might have to be more specific regulations. Like maybe we don't want facial recognition used by the police. I think a lot of people would agree with that. So then that's something different. Then you're regulating and saying that you cannot use it. Or there might be situations, let's say with lending or banking, that or let's take one that I really am interested in is rental, like housing, right? Let's say we say in housing you can't use these kinds of data in an algorithm to make a decision about whether you rent to somebody, right? And then you have to be more specific and actually come in and with targeted regulations, because there are people who are not getting housing because of something that happened in their past, because of a sort of predatory lending that caused their credit to plummet, and then they can never get a house. And that's a horrible thing for society that this happens, and it's definitely a horrible thing for these people. So that won't be fixed by this sort of transparency requirement of the algorithmic impact assessment. But I think having that as the first wave of regulations allows us to then say, you know what, we're able now to identify different areas where we have to have targeted regulations. And so starting with something like this and then moving on and start tackling these higher stakes areas, I think it's a good strategy.
Yeah, iterating. You have to put something out there first just because, and knowing, right, that the first iteration of this is not going to be perfect. But we got to get something out there because it's better than nothing, and then iterate on that and make sure that you continuously try to perfect it and have it be a living law so that you're constantly reassessing it. And so that's a little bit where I'm like, I wonder if I look at the US government and I wonder if they are capable of that to make it be a living law so that it is really being iterated on as opposed to just passing something and then saying, all right, we're good for the next decade or so. And so, but that may just be my pessimism. So you don't need to comment on that at all if you don't want to.
No, I mean, I think a lot of people share your pessimism, including myself. And I think the problem is regulatory bodies tend to be, or legislative bodies tend to be very slow to react to things. And we know this now. And we're entering a time of exponential growth in technological development. And so what has to happen is that we adapt the way that we regulate things such that we take into account the fact that we're never going to be fully on top of it in terms of laws. And so I'm also very pessimistic. They have to pass the right kind of laws that allow a non-legislative body, like a regulatory body, to have broad enough powers to they themselves react to changes in the technology. And so they have to give the right kind of powers to the regulatory bodies within the government, and this goes for the EU as well, such that those regulatory bodies can nimbly react to new dangers that arise because of robotics or AI or the fourth industrial revolution. And that's what we have to get right. And so I'm skeptical that we're going to get that right fast enough. I mean, I don't think necessarily society is going to crumble or anything because of AI. I mean, not yet. But I think
it'll crumble because of something else before that.
Yeah, probably. But I think there is a chance that they can if they pass the right kind of law that gives the right kind of powers to a regulatory body or many regulatory bodies, that allows for a more agile reaction against technology.
So do you foresee something like that matrix that you explained earlier being used as a benchmark? Like I think about my car, and in the US, you go to the DMV and you have to get, if you're in certain states, because I know other states don't really care, but if you're in certain states, you have to get your car checked. And here in Europe, you have to go every year and get your car checked, and they test your suspension, they test your brakes, they make sure you're not polluting too much. And I'm wondering, and so what you have when you go to these places to get tested is that there are machines that will test your brakes, and they'll give you the score of how good your brakes are or whatever it is. And so there has to be some kind of standardization, I imagine, with the auditing from third parties, because if you get an audit from a third party that is really intense and just is taking it to you, then you're never going to, if me as a business owner, I'm going to choose the easy audit much more, especially if I've got something that I need to hide or that I don't want to divulge, right? Then go to the audits that are going to be asking probing questions. So there has to be some kind of standardization, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, so when I originally started this company in 2018, when we started originally working on our matrix and our methodology for working on this, I had in my mind something like a scoring kind of system where I would do something akin to what you're talking about. And there are people who are working on things like that now. But I quickly realized that, my one little tiny company is not going to set the standards for the whole world, right? Or the country. And so it's going to be larger nonprofit organizations. And so, I'm part of, so there's lots of organizations that work on this. IEEE. The one that I'm working with now is called For Humanity, which is it's a nonprofit that is setting standards. It's a collaborative. Anybody could join. You could join. Anyone could join. Where they're iterating on standards for these sorts of audits, and that's what needs to happen. And who knows what the final answer will be, but there absolutely has to be standards, and they have to be industry wide, similar to financial auditing standards. And so, yeah, absolutely. And because you're right, if there are different standards for different auditors, you're going to go with the people who are going to be an easy pass. And similar to, in the U.S., if you get your car inspected, there are some garages that will have my cousin Jimmy, who's going to make sure my car passes. And so I go to my cousin Jimmy's garage, right? We want to avoid that kind of thing with algorithmic auditing. So we need to have those standards.
Yeah, exactly. Or I think back to college and taking the easy class, because it's like, I just need some credits. I need this easy A to get me through. And then you do it. If it's there and it's the easy way to do it, people will take that easy option, sadly. So one thing that I was wondering about as we're talking about audits and looking at it, do you feel like auditing algorithms and auditing machine learning processes within companies makes the teams that are creating these algorithms less agile?
Yes. I think the answer is yes, because it's another structure that you're imposing upon them. And so I'd like to say that no, this is no burden whatsoever, and that you could freely innovate at the same rate or in the same way that you are doing it now. I don't think so. So, but I think the cost benefit is going to is such that it's worth it to do it, because you don't want to be on the bad end of a bad algorithm. Nobody does, whether you're the company or the person who's getting the discriminated against or something like that. So it's worth it. It's going to slow things down, but I don't think it's going to be significant amount of. It's a matter of education. When we work with the company, the biggest allies we have within the company, because we don't just audit now, because that's not something that's mandated by law. So most of what we do now is helping companies make sure that their algorithms are fair and unbiased. And our biggest allies are the data scientists, because they have their hands on the data and the algorithms. And so they have the most access and knowledge to how to fix them as well. And it's basically just an education process where you wake somebody's mind up to the possibility that there are potential dangers in this algorithm. And most are kind of aware at some level, and they're clearly very smart. And so it's not like it takes much prodding. It normally takes me about 10 minutes speaking with an ML engineer to get them to realize that this is a significant worry. Even if oftentimes the first reaction is, well, my algorithm doesn't use race or gender in it, and so I don't see a problem. And it could be something like an algorithm that seems very benign, like searching through medical records and organizing medical records and parsing it out. And then through sort of a Socratic style, asking some questions about who are the people who are being affected? What are the ways in which these records are being used? Do you think that there's a possibility that someone could get missed and that services could get diminished because of you are not parsing them in the same way for every person? And oh, yeah, actually, there's, and the light bulb will come on. It takes very little time. And so I think in the end, once this becomes part of a standard uh, education for machine learning engineers, it's going to be no problem. And people are
Yeah.
working on that now. And I think it's not going to slow things down as much. But for the auditing side, that's just the awareness side of things. But to
Yes.
then, what you need to do is you need to be very careful that as I'm training this algorithm, let's say it's some machine learning thing, as I'm training it, I have to have the right kind of metrics ticking away. I need to plot the right things so that I know immediately whether you're getting bias in there.
Mm.
After you've thought through what are the things I need to watch out for, you need to then be plotting those things as you're training it, and you need to be keeping tabs, and also keeping tabs about what decisions get made and who makes those decisions, because that's also part of the audit. There needs to be some responsibility. People have to be held responsible for what they're doing, and so having an audit trail of how this got developed, who made the decisions, what was being optimized, and why. That's extra infrastructure which will slow them down as it gets implemented. But the hope is once it becomes, as you say, standardized, everybody knows that you just need to output these metrics for these kinds of algorithms and save them and be able to present them to an auditor when it comes time.
Mm.
And there are probably lots of people, and I'm sure people that you've talked to on this podcast or will talk to, that's their business model. They want to be those people who have the platform that
Yeah.
will show you all the right metrics, and that's a nice scalable profitable business. The things that we do are very labor intensive, coming in and doing the hard thinking that it takes to figure out how the hell are we going to actually do that in the first place. And once that kind of work has been done enough, then you come in with a nice beautiful
Tool.
back end platform that just does it all for you, and you get the beautiful plots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so right now it's going to be hard, and no joke, it'll be harder work, but eventually when it's standardized, it's going to be part of the regular workflow that everybody uses.
Yeah, it's such a great point how you're talking about you need to figure out what metrics to track before you even try and just gather all this data, right? And you are the ones that are figuring it out. And so that is a very difficult thing to do. Later, once you know what to track, it's fairly trivial to actually track that. You can have a tool that, like you said, gets a lot of VC money thrown at it and it gets implemented and it will tell you what is happening. But in order to ask the right questions, I think is the key there, and make sure that you're finding these hidden biases. And so I like how you put it in, because that was kind of my next question, was how you foresee the audits happening with companies that have there's a lot of companies that have maybe one or two or five or double digit algorithms in play right now. But then for these companies that have thousands of algorithms in play, this is just like thinking about that just gives me a headache, right? And how this could be scalable, or how, when going back to that agile question of, if every time I'm going to put something into play, it needs to first like pass the audit test, then wait a minute, what do we even have in play right now? I don't even know, right? So that is a really interesting question when you start breaking it down. And I like how you said it. It's like, this is the hard part, figuring out the questions that we need to be asked, and what metrics need to be tracked, and the education, which I hear come up over and over on this podcast, and actually outside of this too, is just, we need to educate those that are, like you said, they're getting their hands dirty with data, so that they can have an open mind and know what exactly to be looking for. And so I'm wondering, like, Do you foresee it as something that is being taught when you sign up for machine learning, or when you want to go to university and your career choice or your degree is in data science? Do you feel like that's something that now will start being taught, or is it not until you get out onto the workforce? How do you foresee that education happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's going to be both places. I think now universities are now already, here at the University of Iowa. My chief ethics officer for Babel just taught, who's a philosophy professor, just taught a ethics of algorithms course, which had philosophy students and also technical students. And so it's going to happen in universities, and they're coming up with sort of certificates and degrees for that sort of thing. But it has to happen within the companies, because there are specific, on the job learning is where, anybody who's gone from college to work knows that you don't really use, except for your ability to think and maybe some basic math and stuff, you don't use what you learn in college. You learn it on the job. And so there has to be, within companies, there has to be education happening that are very specific to your particular use cases, what your company does. And you're absolutely right. In these large companies where there are thousands of algorithms being developed and used, like a Google or Facebook and those large companies, or Amazon, how are you going to do this, right? You're not going to hire 4 PhDs to come in and look at every algorithm every single time, right? You don't. That's not cost effective and not even possible. So, which is one reason why I like, if you look at the way the audits are being set up in For Humanity, this nonprofit I talked about, essentially what they have are audit questions which essentially force or mandate particular structures within the organization that are meant to regulate these sorts of things. So things like algorithmic risk committees, which sounds like that's kind of a new thing. What is that, right? Well, that's what's needed. There needs to be something akin to an algorithmic risk committee within an organization whose job it is to take a look at the various account for, first thing, what are we even using for AI? And then of those things that they're using, trying to assess what are the risky use cases. And it's their job to keep tabs on that. And there's data protection impact assessments that have to happen. Under GDPR now, you have to have a data protection officer. That's something that's new that came up. It's going to have to be these structures that we set up, these governing structures within organizations that are going to do the heavy lifting for those big organizations. And you just have to mandate it. It has to be, you need to have those structures in place. There needs to be audit trails set up so that you know exactly when things get updated and what, each algorithm has to have its own sort of assessment that maybe it's like a template for what kind of tests need to be done. Those need to be all collected in a central location. The algorithmic risk committee has to be able to see those and review those. And so it is a daunting task, but the way we approach it is to say, if I'm going to approach a company that's massive, right? Here in Iowa, we have John Deere, which is this massive company that makes tractors, right? But it uses AI at a massive scale. By the way, you approach a massive company, you have to say, what do I need to know about this company's inner workings to make an assessment as to whether there's some risky things going on? And so then you say, okay, I need to have these kind of structures in the company. I need to have an algorithm risk committee who I can ask about, what are you using for algorithms? What have you done any analysis? That kind of thing. And that's the approach you take. Now, in order to do that, to get back to your training question, that has to be training internal to the organization. And so, in fact, our company, Babel, we're producing training courses now. Firstly, to train our own people that we hire to do audits, so they understand how to do it. our methodology and just standard practice and some basic machine learning stuff, so they know how to talk to people and they know what to look for. But what has to happen is there needs to be this sort of training which is applied at the organizational level, so people can just be upskilling themselves on the kind of knowledge they need to make this happen.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me when you say there needs to be this body within the company, because that's something that I've thought at length about. And aside from a few companies, you don't really have a chief ethics or chief AI ethics position. And so I suspect that will be something that we see more often as time moves forward. Hopefully, I hope that that becomes more of a conversational piece. And so I've got just one or two more questions for you. I know we're running low on time.
I'm fine.
Okay, cool. Well, Giovanna, your coworker, we asked what would be a great question for you. And she said that one thing that you would probably be able to talk about and she wanted to hear you speak of, were what some of the biggest obstacles to ethical audits and regulations of algorithms are.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think at the highest level, capitalism. So let me go from the highest to the lowest, right? I think that our economic structure is, and the way we incentivize people operating in society, that's a big obstacle just for getting ethics done, period. Because you have organizations who, at least in the U.S., are sort of legally people, persons. They have their interests are purely financial, and in fact, they kind of have to be financial. And then you have society, which has its own interests, which are clearly not financial. For the most part, it's not what people want: economic security and things like that. But that's mostly because it allows for a certain standard of living. And so, the way economy works is kind of a big obstacle. So you have to somehow balance those two things. Now, in terms of, and that is relevant for the audit because, currently there's no mandates for audit. So if a company hires us to have us look at or audit their algorithm, they're not doing it. They're doing it because they want to, right? But still, there is a balance between profitability and doing the right thing. And luckily, we've been blessed enough to work with companies who really care, and that hasn't been a problem. And they want to do the right thing. But not all companies are like that. And so that's a essential conflict, which happens with any kind of auditing, third-party auditing. I think in terms of regulation, I think it's a matter of political will. Europe, I think, is doing a pretty good job at the GDPR was a really that's a high watermark for regulation, and I think getting regulation around data, like in California, we have this now, and I think it's going to hopefully extend countrywide. A GDPR equivalent is necessary, but it's political will, because the way the political system works, at least in our country, is that because companies are persons, legal persons, they can influence politics via money. And so if you are a bad actor, or if you just don't even want to have to deal with having this extra structure on the outside where you have to audit things, you can influence politics such that those things don't get passed. And so that's problematic across industries. And so for regulation, I think it's just a matter of there has to be enough political will. Now, in the past 2 years, given the number of scandals that have happened and the press that has come out about AI and the dangers of AI, and not the super intelligent AI. We're talking about standard AI. I think there's enough motivation on the part of politicians that they know their constituents care about this issue. And so hopefully that's enough to get legislation passed that actually has some teeth and can make a difference. And, I care a lot about auditing because that's what I do. But there are also lots of other ways in which you can regulate AI, just through plain old regulation, which will ban certain things and all of that. And so, I fixate on auditing because that's the most fun and that's what I do. But there are other ways to govern AI, both within organizations and through legislation. But I think in the end, auditing will be a critical piece to that.
Yeah, it seems like the right way forward. And there are a few things that you mentioned there that I wonder about. Like, you're talking about these companies that you're going in and auditing, and they're doing it out of the good of their heart, we could say. Nobody is mandating them to do it. And if they were to hit some kind of T in the road where they say, okay, it's either we get rid of this and we are less profitable, or we are ethical, or sorry, we get rid of this, we're less profitable and we're ethical, or we're just unethical about it, then that's a very hard question for companies to answer if there's not any kind of weight behind it. If it's just you saying, hey, there's this audit that I'm doing, this is what we found, here's these things you're not going to like, and then later they have to make the choice. Like you said, you have to be very, very interested in this because of the way that the structure of society is built, right? We're being incentivized for these different reasons. And it echoes something that we've talked about on the podcast a few times, of the incentivification of this it's backwards. It's a little bit reverse sometimes, and we really see it. And so, to the point of when someone gets an audit from you, then what they can show, do they use that in marketing? Is it just so that they can sleep better? Is it something that they feel like they're changing the planet? Like, what is the incentive? Why would they want to do that? And then how can they use it and know that it is a proper audit and all of that?
Yeah. So I think the biggest motivator, with the companies we're working for, I genuinely think they care about making the world a better place. So we've been incredibly lucky. I know we're going to come across companies where that's not the primary motivator, and we have to deal with that. But I think the majority of companies, when it comes time to start doing this, their motivation will be risk management. And they're going to be, because of the way the public is reacting to these sorts of algorithms, they're going to realize that there's a significant both compliance risk and a reputational risk to deploying algorithms without having ensured that they're not going to hurt people. And so their motivation will be internally to say, all right, this is too risky. The audit says that this is too risky, or there are these significant risks. Either there's mitigation that we could do to get rid of that risk or to downplay it, or we have to scrap it and do something different. And so that's one. So in a big company that may be a big vendor that makes lots of algorithms, that's one motivation for them, is they just move on to the next thing or the next idea. There will be some cases where a motivation might be for PR, right? If it's not mandated by law, they might do it because they want to appear like they are doing the right thing. And that's,
if they've already had a problem.
Probably. Yeah, they might have already had a problem and they realize that they need something, right? I'm less interested in working with those kind of people. Not to say that I wouldn't, because I think even those kind of people can be convinced of the genuine need for this. And so, but I think there are probably a lot of people who are companies that would think, you know what, other people are doing it now. We should probably do it, because if we don't, we're going to look like idiots, you know?
Yeah.
And so there is that aspect. I'd rather avoid, as long as I can, working with that kind of company, because in order for, especially if it's not mandated, in order for us to have any impact on a company, us meaning Babbel, our company doing this, or any company that does it, we have to have buy-in from that company that it matters. And so we have to be talking to the sort of leadership. We have to be talking to the people who make decisions, and they have to be convinced that that what we're doing has value, separate from profits, and that it's the right thing to do. And so if we don't have that buy-in, nothing's going to get done, and it may be for nothing, right? And so that's the worry, which is why I badly want it to be regulated, because then I can go in and just know that I'm working with everybody who needs this done, and I don't have to stress about that, because right now I do stress about that. Before we take a client, we really have to think, do we want to be working with this person? Are we just going to be a PR thing, or is it going to be for real? Luckily, everything has been for real, and so we're happy with that. But I don't want to have to make that choice. I'd rather just be, I'm coming in no matter what, because you need it done. Everybody wants it. This has to be transparent, and we're just going to do it, do our job. And that's what I want. And that's the future. And that, I think, we're going to be one of many companies that are going to do this when that becomes, because it's going to be a massive market. Just look at the financial audit market.
Yep.
It's huge. So the day will come eventually.
Yeah. And then the companies will give you the small room with no heat and no windows like they do to the financial auditors.
That's right.
But for you, it's very true. You don't need to have to think about it. If there's regulation around it, you don't have to look at it as, is there a PR stunt here, or is there some alternative motives that are happening? And one thing that I was realizing when you were talking about how you're basically the stamp of approval for these algorithms, that puts a lot of pressure on you, or a lot of responsibility in your hands. And so how do you mitigate that? Because I imagine there could be a case one day where something happens wrong with AI and the company says, but we got audited and everything was fine. So it's not our fault. It's the auditor's problem.
Yeah, no, this is why it's risky working in an unregulated and unstandardized area, because there are no standards. And so the way we're mitigating that, until there are standards, when there are standards, there will be clear lines of transparency and audit trails. They call them audit trails for a reason, is that you can trace back what actually happened. Who made what decision? Was there some omission that was made? And it might be that, we hope that it's not something that we missed. But when you have that framework of standardization, then you just make sure you check all the boxes and you do your due diligence. And that's how you protect yourself and others, by doing that. We don't have that right now. And so the way we're mitigating this is we focus on transparency. Mm-hmm. So it's not, these are our findings. We're not saying that this system is not going to be misused, or that if you update your model, it's not going to become biased. We're just saying, here's a snapshot of what this algorithm looks like right now and how you're using it right now. And here's all the data that we use to test this, and this is how it was done, and this is how we made our evaluation. And that transparency is the sort of mitigation, that risk that you're talking about. We just say, this is what it looks like now. That's not to say that somebody's not going to change something in the future. And if we miss something, then that's on us. That is on us. If we didn't do the right kind of tests, or something happened, that is on us. That's a risk any business takes when they are providing a professional service that requires some expertise. You have to do your job well. And so we take it very seriously. And there also aren't very many companies that are doing this. In fact, I don't really know too many. I've talked to people, I've heard of companies that do this, but I don't know for real companies that are actually in the trenches doing it right now. So we're some of the early people working on this. And so it's actually kind of important that we really get it right. And that's something that we worry about, because if early companies like us get it wrong or mess up or something like that, or are used as PR stunts, right, that takes away the legitimacy. And we need that credibility, because this is, I think, critically important for society, that we have this infrastructure of trust set up as we move forward. And so we're fully cognizant of the fact that we have to tread carefully and do a really good job and a careful job, because there's going to be a lot of people who are going to enter this industry, and we have to be good examples.
Yeah, that trust is everything. I see that very clearly. So before I ask the last question, I will let everyone know that if they are not following you or connected with you on LinkedIn, I find it super helpful, everything that you share, and just those times that it's like, oh, you commented on something. I cannot tell you how much value I get from the random articles that pop up from you being in my network. So I recommend for everyone to go out there and follow you or connect with you, because it's been super helpful for me. I find so much great stuff. And so it's really cool to see what you're doing and to see how you're doing it, and for you to talk to us about it. So the last question that I have is, are you a robot?
Am I a robot? That's a really good question. I think I am. I think I'm a robot in the sense of, well, I'm a kind of hard determinist. So like I don't know how people, I don't know how other people have answered this question, but I actually believe, not 100% believe in the sense of like kind of type of like unwavering religious kind of belief or anything. But my general assumption as a scientist is, I think that there probably isn't a whole lot of free will, actually. You know, the things that I do and say right now are really governed almost 100% by what's happened in the past. And so in some sense, I do think I'm an automaton, very much like a robot. I'm just a highly complex one. And that my experience of myself is that I have free will, and that I'm not a robot, and that I can do and say whatever I want. And other people's experiences of me are the same, and of themselves. But I think in reality, probably the difference between me and a robot is that I'm just much more complex, and instead of metal and wires, it's electric, biological circuits and things.
Yeah. Wow. That was a great answer. I love it. And I thank you again for talking to us. This has been...
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I'll let you go and get back to doing your daily things and saving the world. I really, really want to, again, say thanks, and I'll see you later, Shane.
Yeah, thank you. See you.
Cheers.